Hello, everyone. Welcome. Okay, get rid of that phase. Welcome back. I am Kris. This is General Washington, the American Revolution with Edward Lengel. This is from History Rebels. This is episode 10. I guess I could have read that right there. 10 of 12. One unavailable video is hidden. Well, I don't want that. Hey, stop. Okay. Now, before we get started, if you could click that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. That's all it took. Completely free, easiest thing you could ever do. If you could do that, it helps me out. Click on that thanks button if you'd like to donate to the channel, throw some money, and then your name sponsors a video if you request one. You can request without donating. This is going to be 2 parts. I'm going to break it at the 20-minute mark. Just because. All right, let's get into it.
He's a man of great strategic genius, and he is a nation builder. And I think his legacy is greater than that of Napoleon or Frederick the Great for that reason. Frederick the Great and Napoleon, you can see at those moments in history, they were astonishing. Washington's legacy is still living with us now, 250 years later.
Welcome to History Rebels and this deep dive into George Washington, his military career, and his impact through the American Revolution. We're joined by author and historian Edward Lengel, an expert on the subject who's written a number of books on Washington's life and legacy. You can find out more in the links in the description.
So Washington, as a young man, he had his formative experiences during the French and Indian War. He had served under British command at a number of different engagements, places called Fort Necessity in 1754 in western Pennsylvania, and then the Battle of the Monongahela.
The Fort Necessity, that was a disaster. A disaster.
54 in West.
Which was, I mean, that shaped his thinking in the future, but that was a disaster. Ooh.
Western Pennsylvania, and then the Battle of the Monongahela in 1755 under General Edward Braddock. Lots of legends about that. Lots of Washington's life is steeped in legend. But then after the French and Indian War was over, he
side note, there was a man, British soldier, well, he was Irish, but he was serving with the British at the Battle of Monongahela, and after Braddock died, his name was, I think it was Hugh Jackson. Was that right? Okay. I think it was I'm thinking Hugh Jackman, and that's why I felt like it was off. Hugh Jackson. Anyways, apologies. He was an Irish soldier. Braddock gets killed. There's a complete panic. Washington leads everyone out of there, gets out of the battle, gets people to safety. He kind of is the one in charge of just the retreat. And this Hugh Jackson ends up going back home. After the war, he's promised some land, and he wants to come back and claim it because he didn't have a family or anything. So he asked his brother. I thought I was going to sneeze for a second. He asked his brother. I don't remember the brother's name. Damn it. He asked the brother, "Hey, will you come with me?" And the brother's like, "Absolutely." Brother's married, has 2 kids, or 1 kid at the time. And they're planning up to leave. The day they're going to leave, or the night before, Hugh Jackson approaches his brother and says, "Hey, I met a woman. I can't leave. I can't meet. She's the one." So he stays. Hold on. So he stays and Hugh Jackson stays in Ireland. The other guy, the brother, oh my goodness, stop. The brother goes to America with his family, settles down at the Waxhaw area, and the Hugh Jackson wanted to come back because of the land that the British had promised him, and he was very grateful for George Washington saving his life. That was why he wanted to go. He ends up staying. The brother, as I said, comes to America, and the brother gets killed in a logging accident. He has 2 children, and his wife is pregnant with his 3rd child. The 3rd child is born and ends up being Andrew Jackson, the future War of 1812 general and semi-lunatic and future 7th president. It's always a funny thing for me because I don't think Jackson excuse me, I don't think Jackson cared for Washington so much, but it's like, Washington did save his uncle's life, and his uncle was very fond of him. And because of that and the land promised, that was why he came over. And it's just one of those things that I think is a cool little story.
Became first and foremost a businessman, a planter, an agriculturalist, but I think he would have described himself as a farmer, but also as an entrepreneur, somebody who was trying to modernize his approach to farming and to agriculture, and his attitude toward how he should develop his own estate and to how the United States, well, the colonies at that time, should develop. And he made his living on trade with Great Britain. That carried with it a lot of frustrations in the colonial system and the mercantilist system as it existed at the time, that the British government sought to keep the colonies in a state of dependence. There are a lot of different aspects of that. I could talk about that endlessly, but
I don't want to interrupt him. I was thinking he was going to continue with another comment that he had made, which was about being a farmer and stuff. He was big on reading about farming practices in England and stuff like that. He ended up after the tobacco, he moved away from tobacco because it was so harsh for the land. He started to plant, what was it called? I keep thinking star something, cloves and stuff like that. And he started crop rotation because he had heard in England it worked and it saves the land. And so he would have like 1 year he would grow, and this is just a rough example, but just go with me, like corn 1 year. That's not. Okay, we'll say corn. Next year, green beans. And then the next year was like cloves, wild hay, whatever. The year after that was like star something, whatever it was, and something natural that he planted, but he planted that because it was good for the soil. And then on the 5th year, he had like this 4 or 5 year rotation plan where you did like 2 years of something and then 2 years of not of something else. And one of his farms, if you visit the property and you're looking at the home, it's off to the right. Oh, come on, really? It's off to the right, past the tomb and everything, and you can go down. It's by the dock, and there's this lowland farm area there. And he used to have all the slaves or enslaved, whatever you're supposed to call them. He would have them pull silt out of the Potomac, and they would pull that silt and they would cover the fields. And that was kind of like putting all that silt, you're putting all that nutrients back onto the field. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
That really, more than anything else, a sense of frustration with the constricted economic system that existed in the colonial relationship was what drove Washington to supporting revolution. Now, he was interested in ideas Not as much as Jefferson, not as much as many of the other founders of liberty and equality and the political system. For Washington, the issue with the relationship was really primarily economic. He felt that so long as the British powers kept the colonies in a subservient relationship and prevented American businessmen and entrepreneurs and farmers from developing and growing and becoming profitable and becoming successful, that he described that as a form of slavery, as something that would keep Americans in thrall. And I think, as an economist would describe it, that the colonies had reached a point of takeoff economically. We're just starting, even though it's an anachronism in the 18th century, just starting to take off from the runway, but that they were being held down and prevented from taking advantage of the opportunities they knew that were there. So if you look at Washington in the few years before the Revolution broke out, he worked, for example, with George Mason, a Virginia patriot, on something called the Fairfax Resolves, named after Fairfax, Virginia. They were a number of different statements about problems that Mason and Washington had with the colonial relationship. Mason wrote the political part. Washington wrote the economic part. And you get to 1774, you get to 1775. Washington is very cautious. He's not a rabble rouser. He's not somebody who rushes quickly to arms, but he has decided this relationship is not working. And once the First Continental Congress in 75 and the first American 74 and 75 and the Second Continental Congress, and the first shots are fired at Lexington and Concord in April of 75, and Washington sees that it has come to a contest of arms. He accepts it. This is just the reality. It's become a military contest. Not what he wanted. He felt like we needed to fight an economic war. He would have preferred to keep it at that. But once the shots were fired, he felt we have no choice but to go forward. So to summarize, it was a slow process for him. There were a lot of different elements of it. He continued to look up to and admire Great Britain, but he felt that Americans needed to share fully in the prosperity. He sensed the first beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, which is usually dated by historians now to about 1760 or so. Washington sensed that something was happening. He wanted to be a part of it, and he didn't want to be locked out. So that really, in a nutshell, is what drove him to that break. There are a lot of different elements that went into the selection of Washington in June of 75 as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. One, and it's usually pointed to, is that Washington was a unifying figure. He could pull together New England and the South. New England was a hotbed of revolution. The South was more cautious. Washington could bring them together and help to foster a unified revolution. But another thing about Washington is that he wasn't a rabble rouser. He wasn't a demagogue. He inspired a sense of trust. And that's something I would keep getting back to Washington throughout the Revolutionary War, is that people felt they could trust him. That is a very big deal, given that Americans are paranoid about an Oliver Cromwell type figure. This is before Napoleon, obviously, but they're paranoid about any kind of a figure who's going to use this opportunity to take control. And it's something culturally deep in Great Britain, as well as the United States, a sense that if you have a standing army, if you have an army that becomes too powerful, then it begins to look out for its own interests instead of the national interest. So there's a tremendous fear among many people that if we choose the wrong person to lead the army, we might get somebody who's just going to take control. And Washington inspires that sense of trust. Now he does also have military experience. However, I wouldn't even say he's the most militarily experienced individual in the colonies. There are others who have a lot of experience, who will become generals in the Continental Army. That's part of it, but it was more a unifying, a trustworthy, and not a ranting kind of a demagogue. That was very important. The first thing to keep in mind about Washington and the war.
If you replace Washington with John Stark, and John Stark, I'm sorry, not in the Revolutionary War, in the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, and everyone hears about the exploits of John Stark, which he fought in it. People would have that kind of same view of Stark when the Revolutionary War had started. I think Stark was a better military guy. He was a much better military guy. He was good. But Stark was old by the time the Revolutionary War started. I think he was in his 60s. So it wouldn't have. He had more experience, but I don't know if the people would have trusted him as much as they did Washington. You just felt safer with Washington, if that makes sense.
This is very important strategically. Washington thought time was not on the side of the Americans. He thought if this becomes a long contest, Great Britain's going to win. And he bases that on a pretty astute economic analysis. There's some amazing letters that Washington writes where he goes over the whole European economic situation, the British staying power. He says, Great Britain's in debt. They do have some issues, but they have the capacity to wage war almost endlessly. That's certainly going to be proven true in the Napoleonic Wars. And he feels the United States does not. We're inventing an economy out of nothing.
Also, the Napoleonic Wars happened in England's backyard as opposed to coming overseas to fight. So you're putting a strain on the economy that's a little bit different, and you're sending troops to a much shorter distance than you are sending them to the Americas.
We have no kind of a basis, no industry, no solid economic base for continuing a war for a long period of time. All that being said, he thinks we got to end the war as quickly as possible. So what he's looking for is a spectacular victory right out of the gate. He's very disappointed in Boston that after Bunker Hill, when the British lose so many casualties at Bunker Hill in June of 75, that William Howe, who becomes commander-in-chief, avoids confrontation, avoids major battles. Washington keeps trying to prod him in Boston into a knockdown, drag-out bloodbath. Washington wants a bloodbath and something that will end the war right away in a horrible way, but convince the British, no, this isn't worth it. He's very disappointed, actually, when William Howe gathers up his forces and leaves Boston. It's always presented as a great victory for the Americans in March of 76 as the British leave Boston. Washington was disgusted and disappointed because he wanted a battle. He didn't get a battle. So when the British assemble what was up to that time the biggest amphibious fleet in history to launch an assault on New York City, Washington takes one look at New York and he's thinking, I don't think I can really defend this place. I don't need to get into the tactics, but it's practically impossible to defend against if the other side has mastery of the sea, which Britain does. You can't defend that place, but Congress insists that you have to defend it. So Washington tries his best. The British end up landing on Staten Island and Long Island. And then Washington kind of observes the battle on Long Island and Brooklyn Heights from his place in Brooklyn, his headquarters in Brooklyn Heights. From a distance, the Americans get pummeled and just can't handle the tactical prowess of the British Army. William Howe is a superb tactician. He is one of the best tacticians of his generation. And that's something you really can't take away from him. He knows how to handle an army in the field. And Howe just whips the Americans on sight and shatters the army. They flee in defeat. It's really a no contest. Washington is sitting in his fortified headquarters in Brooklyn Heights. This is where William Howe makes a decision not to take advantage of the victory and storm Brooklyn Heights. Many people say if he had simply let his momentum carry itself forward, assaulted the defenses at Brooklyn Heights, Washington would have had no chance of getting away. That would have been pretty much the end. But Howe is himself a Whig. He has some sympathy for the colonies. He's a professional, but he's also trying to avoid another massacre. He knows we can storm Brooklyn Heights. They're going to take a lot of casualties. He wants the war to end in a negotiated peace. He thinks if we...
I was just about to say, he didn't want to kill Washington. So I think that was a big part of why he never really went at him as much. And he didn't want to kill him because the fear of killing Washington, what's that do for the colonies? Who's the next person up? You know, he would rather, we'll have a battle. We're going to do this, but let's cut it here. And let's just agree that this is over now. You see, you can't win. Let's just call it. Unfortunately, when you're in that position, and that's what you want to have happen, the other side has to play ball if they feel like that's their best option. Washington didn't believe that was the best option. And I think Washington also knew that any surrender would be met with him being hanged. That's not a surrender. That's walking into a death sentence. You know, you'd rather die fighting than die surrendering. And I think that's just kind of what it was. But it's easy for us now, 200 some years later, to armchair quarterback the whole thing and say, well, maybe this or maybe that. We don't know. We're not 100%.
If we have that kind of bloodbath Washington is looking for, it's going to make a negotiated peace harder. So Howe decides not to storm Brooklyn Heights. Washington then evacuates in peace, crosses over to Manhattan. Howe lands on Manhattan. The American army, for a lot of different reasons, is not handled well, flees up north of Manhattan, and then runs across New Jersey. The British defeat them in just about every engagement. There are a few exceptions, but keep outmaneuvering them in the field, and that's what leads Washington in his epic retreat across New Jersey. It's a pretty complete whipping. So Washington's army has retreated across the Delaware River. The Continental Congress is in disarray, flees Philadelphia. Everybody's afraid the British are going to cross over the river. Howe probably didn't intend to do that, but they're afraid that he's going to do that anyway. The British have conquered New Jersey. There have been a lot of atrocity stories that have been spread around, especially about the Germans who are parts of the British Army, that they've been committing atrocities, and they kind of did. They did some pretty bad stuff, and so it seems like the Continental War effort, the American war effort, is at its low ebb. What turned it around? Why did Washington decide to turn it around, and what motivated him there? I think the key is one of the brilliant things about Washington is that a lot of generals are very blinkered. They're focused only on what's happening on the battlefield. And Washington had an understanding that his role was not just to manage what was happening on the battlefield, but to have the big vision, the strategic vision, to look at the big picture. He was always thinking about the war effort. He was always thinking about what I mentioned earlier, time not being on the American side, and the economy being near to collapse. The American economy was always close to collapse. So Washington keeps his finger on the pulse, the popular pulse. He thinks, oh my gosh, Americans are starting to trade with the British again. All right, the British have hard currency. They can offer hard currency to American farmers. We have worthless continental dollars, which are, nothing. So Washington sees this. He's beginning to sense a turn that this war could be lost right now. Not so much because of military defeat, but because American people decide this just isn't worth it anymore. So that is what motivates him really to turn around and launch a last-ditch attack across the Delaware River. That he realizes he has to risk everything in order to change the popular mood, to convince Americans that, yeah, we're still out here to fight. The assault across the Delaware that night, Christmas night, supposed to be multiple columns coming across. It turns out to be just Washington's column that makes it across. He's taken this boat over the frozen, partially frozen Delaware River, ice flows, floating down, miserable weather, and then he leads the troops on this night march to the Hessian garrison, or the German garrison, I always try to say, because they weren't all from Hesse, to the German garrison at Trenton, launches the surprise attack. The legend is that the Germans had been partying and they were all hungover or drunk. The story is not true. Truth is, they were worn out from constant patrolling. He ends up defeating them, capturing the garrison. Cornwallis then comes in. Pretty quickly, Washington's able to convince some of his troops to hang on, stay enlisted, keep fighting. Cornwallis almost corners him at Trenton. Washington slips around Cornwallis's back and heads up to Princeton and defeats the British at Princeton, and then skips up into the mountainous region of New Jersey to hunker down there. It's one of Washington's finest tactical moments. He was up and down throughout the war. This was one moment when he really outmaneuvered the British tactically. The first time in his career that he'd shown tactical genius. But it was a gamble. It was a gamble that paid off, and a gamble had to be taken. No question about it, Washington had great personal bravery, physical bravery. He never flinched under fire. To be fair, so did William Howe. He was also physically brave. No question about it. But Washington did have a great capacity to stand under fire, to inspire his men. They knew he was still there. However, he had yet to gain, by 1776, he had not yet gained the complete confidence of his army. 76, 77, his bravery was there. Yes, he showed it at Princeton. He showed it during the retreat from Manhattan at a place called Kip's Bay. He showed it multiple times, but that wasn't quite enough to gain the total devotion of his army. That was something that would happen at Valley Forge. The fall campaign of 77 is really one of the most fascinating military campaigns ever to take place in North America. The fall campaign.
We're going to go ahead and end it there since it's kind of broken up that way. And we will be back with part 2. I'm enjoying this. I hope you are. It's nice to have somebody else just kind of reflecting on it. Okay. Well, back with part 2. Until then, have a good day, have a good night.